Alright, so throughout this month, we have kind of been exploring and realizing just how many different things can be done with the horror genre and how many different kind of threats that we can run into when you're really exploring the genre. And yeah, if you look hard enough, even books are not safe. So I thought we would go into these two where the horrors come off the page and potentially into reality. Or may actually just be our reality. And I obviously want to start with In the Mouth of Madness. And this is the thing about this. The very first thing you want to look at is pretty much how very off the radar it ended up going, particularly at its time of release. Because you look at Carpenter's name and you think, yeah, he'd done like The Thing, and we do get to have, big special effects like that movie had. But really, when you think of Carpenter's name, I imagine the first thing most people think of is Halloween, the, original minimalist horror movie. At least from since the 30s or so, when we were in kind of starting to get into an effects age when he made that movie in 78, and it was still very much, it was one of the most effective horror movies ever made, if not the most effective horror movie ever made, with being very bare bones. So then you jump to the 90s, when we're pretty much in this not so great phase. This would have been probably the year before Scream, so this was before people were really trying to change up horror in the 90s. So we were kind of stuck in this vein where it was all, let's just be as basic with horror as possible and as easy and simple as possible. So I think when In the Mouth of Madness came out, with John Carpenter's name on it, people probably didn't get what they were expecting. Because this clearly goes into the whole Lovecraft territory and takes, enormous inspiration from that, to the point that I'm actually kind of surprised that Lovecraft doesn't have, his name is not in the credits somewhere as an inspiration or his works or whatever. There's, to the point, at the Mountains of Madness. I mean, clearly, the title is... but the thing here is, it's also, and while there is, not only do they just go through many of his themes and many of his ideas, also when you look at the titles of the books, many of them are in relation. There's also a lot of people that take it as a reference to King, which I can see that too, especially the setting. And if you look we talk about the titles of the books and the movies being clearly Lovecraft references, the font is King, though, which I always found interesting, but it's much more in the Lovecraft territory, with maybe just a tiny hint of King in there, with clear references to King as well by name. And so we go into this, and I like the fact, for starters, that it was clear he was kind of changing it up to begin with at the very start, with the way he bookends with this kind of rock score. How the rest of the movie is kind of the more or less traditional score that he would do. But at during the beginning credits and the end credits, you have this rock score that just really stands out, and it kind of... I like the fact that it doesn't really interrupt the movie. If it were more in the score than just the beginning and end, I think it would be weird and out of place. But I like that it's pretty much kept at just the very beginning and the very end, to kind of, almost like it's kind of showing these combating worlds almost, where one is just really loud and in your face, albeit very cool. And the rest is kind of very downplayed, as if based in reality, more or less. So, so we go into this, and obviously it's almost like a PI kind of setup, to where it's like, hey, somebody's gone missing, and we need you to look for him. And it's as simple as that. Team up with a woman you may or may not be able to trust, and go into the unknown, and kind of try to solve a mystery of sorts, and retrieve something. It's almost like, I'm trying to avoid saying noir territory, but kind of somewhat with that tiny little setup, just at the very beginning. And then I really like what he does. This is easily one of Carpenter's more visually interesting movies. And I really love this stuff that just kind of grabs you immediately when they're just driving down the road, and then suddenly it's like everything's dark, and it's like the only thing that exists now is the road, and we can't see where it's going or what's around it. And then every now and then something will appear on it, and we don't know if it's going to be human or not, or if it's going to be frightening or not, because we start off and it's just a normal kid on a bike. Not Hayden Christensen, who comes in later, but just a kid on a bike. And it seems normal, and then we get that shot back when the tail lights are hitting him, and there's just kind of something hellacious about this image of this kid that just has nothing but red reflecting on him surrounded by darkness. And then it's at this point where we kind of feel like we're going into another reality, and like everything has changed now. And then we get the dude on the bike. Whatever that means, whoever he is, it makes us feel like this is where we're thrust into something that is not reality and something that is much more frightening. And that's before we blatantly get into that by them just somehow driving right into daylight. But I really like how this scene kind of serves as like that transition from one to another, and we can actually kind of feel when we're going from what we think is reality to what clearly the line is much more blurred when we get to the other side of this road. And there are moments when this movie really does work when they're playing with that stuff. I really like the way that it kind of basks in some of its weird and bizarre characters. And this is before they even really start kind of coming off totally unnatural. There is something unnatural kind of from the start. That's what makes them so intriguing, but it's almost like it's kind of the combination of them and their kind of seemingly isolated environment in this town that does feel... There is very much a feel of going from a real place to somehow inside a fictional place. And they all just kind of adapt... They kind of have shown there's kind of been this adaptation where everything from the characters to the background feels like we're inside a story that's, I guess, inside a story. And we meet people like, there's the guy that he later meets again at the bar that's at the front of the mob that was Vigo in Ghostbusters 2, who has a, and not to say anything bad about the guy, but I mean, it's like, and I'm sure, you know, obviously Ivan Reitman saw this too, where it's like, that guy has a way about him to where just his appearance alone, there's just something that feels... He just kind of feels off. I don't know if that's just because I grew up with Ghostbusters 2 and I immediately see him as this world-ending ghost, but there's something about this guy where even when he's playing just a regular dude, he's got like the flannel jacket and the jeans and stuff, he still just kind of has this way about him to where it's like, it just feels like an unnatural setting because he's here. Even if he's playing a somewhat normal character until we get to the scene in the bar. Then there is Frances Bay, who Jerry Seinfeld took the rye from, or Happy Gilmore's grandma. And here also plays somebody that... She has that very warm presence about her, as we saw in stuff like her previous work, or after this as well, mainly. And then we see these secrets that are kind of hiding out. It's kind of like a whole... Once again, I hate to use an overused comparison here, but it's like... It kind of feels very much like a Lynch world where there's something underneath what seems to be normal. And this moment when we know that she's supposed to have a husband and we wonder where he is, and then we see where he is, and it just really kind of sets off this... no other character, basically apart from Sam Neill, can be trusted now that we're in this other reality. And then that kind of just gives it a constantly unsettling feel. Even down to just little things like the three-legged dog. Just even that feels very... We just get him in like one shot, and it's just like everything. It just sets everything off and makes it feel weird. And even when we're in what I guess is reality, when we have characters like the kooky character that John Glover is doing, which he obviously is basically mastered at this point. And they just really kind of bring each, no matter what world we're in, they really just bring it to life, these characters. Even if they're only here for like 30 seconds. And it's kind of a shame we don't really get to bask in them more than we do, but it's nice that they do get the time that they do. But talking about time as well, there is now this is kind of a double-ended question when you look at where the movie ultimately goes, because it's kind of like, this is one of those movies where it's kind of hard to tell if it's like, you could almost see it as cheating, but you could also see it as meticulously planned from the get-go. But it's like, there are some things you want to criticize in this movie, but once you realize where it's going and what the concept ends up being, it's kind of like, do those criticisms still hold water? Because you could just easily explain that stuff away with where the story ends up going. Like, the fact that Sam Neill and Julie Carmen, I think is her name, the very subpar actress they put in the very crucial role of the editor here, and they seem to have come to this town for different reasons, because initially it just seemed like, oh, she's just here to go with you because she wants to investigate or whatever. She's obviously very much into the work and wants to find out what is going on and find this manuscript as well. And then we kind of do this double thing where Sam Neill's starting to act like the whole thing is staged. And it's kind of like, I get it. If Sutter Kane has sold as many copies as you say he has, he probably can't afford a ruse this elaborate. But the whole thing about, you just want me to go back and talk about the haunted town so you can sell more copies, and it's like, I get where you're coming from, and I get how this might seem like reality breaking, but it's like, I think you're reaching a little bit. And it's like, I know you don't want to, I mean, I know it's less reaching than to say, huh, I think this town has come alive out of this book. But still, it seems very quick that he's like, oh, this is clearly staged. And it's like, it'd be kind of nice to know how he came to this conclusion so fast, because that would be such an elaborate ruse. It's like, okay, you quickly came to that conclusion, and you seem very passionate about it. You seem absolutely in concrete that this is your belief, that this is what's happening right now. Not necessarily that, you know, this is a town that he based something on or whatever. It's all been put together just to fool you, so you will go back to the news. But whatever floats his boat, he is in an interesting scenario. But then we kind of counter this by her saying, well, it started off as a ruse, but now it's not. So, okay, so from her perspective, it's like, number one, let's say she was half in on a full ruse. So it's like, if they really went out of their way to make this a giant ruse, as she apparently claims it was supposed to be, it never once occurs to her, maybe there's something they didn't let me in on for the effect. But no, she immediately comes to the conclusion that I just talked about earlier was insane. Nope, I was only in on half this ruse. I think the town's actually alive. I think the book is alive. And it's like, wow, we're moving very quickly with these assumptions. But, like I said, if we're going to come to the conclusion that none of this is a reality and it's all the book, then maybe this is a moot point altogether. I don't know. But in the meantime, if you want to build up, like, if we're looking strictly from the perspective of a first-time viewing, these are certainly questions that I think will be raised and really kind of throw off how you feel about the rest of the story as it unfolds. So it really just depends on how you handle stuff like that, I guess. And that's the thing, too, is that I think, like I said, either one of these conclusions might seem a bit more, better suit where we're going in the flow here if the movie had more build-up. If there's one problem this movie has, because you look at it and it kind of feels like maybe they're just trying to get to the monsters and the effects too soon, so they're kind of rushing this stuff at the beginning to get to the moments when we pan over and there's a zombie-like guy there for the jump scare or whatever, and then everybody kind of turning into monsters and all that, and it's like the movie seems like in a hurry to get there. I think it's fine when we get to that stuff. It's the fact that we get there too soon, and I'm not saying I would necessarily cut out any of the big effects and monster stuff that we get. It's the fact that this movie is not long enough. This movie is like an hour 35. It can be 2 hours. Usually I don't jump on the idea of expanding a movie's length to better it, because lately we have such a problem with movies being so overblown. This is a movie that definitely could have benefited being 2 hours. Like maybe an hour 15 of him investigating the town and interacting with the locals and just getting this really bizarre feel of this town and questioning, is this real or not? And then 45 minutes of the big special effects and monsters and all that stuff. Sutter Kane himself needs more screen time too. With all this build-up and an actor that's totally capable of playing that off with Prochnow, it's like you barely used him. And he's like the whole big deal here. He's like the whole centerpiece of this thing. And he's just kind of here as quite literally a gateway. And that kind of seemed like a wasted opportunity where we could have played with it a little more and really kind of let us relish in our characters more, especially him. That some of the I love the locals, but the fact that some of them get more screen time than Sutter Kane does feels very unbalanced and very off. But they do kind of try to balance this with the way that and I can totally see this getting criticism, but the fact that when the monsters do come, even though they do come too quickly, I think, they're not shown off very well, with considering how elaborate the practical effects are. But I do think that kind of also balances out the fact that we got to them too quickly, to where it doesn't feel like we immediately jumped into something. There's still the moment when they're like running down the hallway or the tunnel or whatever, and it's dark and we can only get glimpses of them, to where it's kind of like, it sucks that the department would go through all the trouble of making these really elaborate effects that you barely get to see. But in a sense, it's also effective in itself, that we just get these brief flashes of them, and like kind of some of it is left up to our imagination. And when they're all in this group like this, and how every one is like a different one, and the way he didn't really kind of repeat anything he'd done in his previous movies, like how easily it would have been to do something very similar to The Thing. But they all kind of have their own different individual appearance about them. It's just the movie seems like it gets there so quickly to them, and then we're not quite sure exactly how well it actually looks. But I do think that there is somewhat of a balance there, to where that kind of counters the previous criticism, so there's that. And yeah, I can understand if there's a problem where it's like, we have a nice feel here, and then we kind of start to get into the monsters, but even after the monsters are already in it, and we're getting into that territory, it does kind of seem like the third act just completely goes off. Like, just, like, we're here, and then it's like, then we're here, and it's like, okay, I kind of get where we got here, and then just, where the fuck did we go? I do kind of get that vibe, but it does kind of, you know, play up the whole bending reality and all that, and just making this character feel like we're in this character's shoes, because this character at this point really has no idea what the fuck's happening to him, and it really starts to come to a close, his sanity, more or less, when he realizes he's basically in the hell version of Pleasantville, and there is no end. He just keeps circling back around. And I do really like the effect that plays, and how there are movies that I'm sure there is a point, and I'm sure, like, through 100 viewings or so, you can piece it all together. But I do also kind of like the idea, if you watch it 1 or 2 times and you're still vague on what's going on after a while, I do think that works too, to be totally lost in something like this, especially if, like, the whole movie, it might get tiresome, but when we get what we're doing for a while, and then it uses this opportunity to just go off and just confuse the shit out of us, I think actually kind of works in this context. Because it's all about that descent into complete insanity and madness and all that. Not to mention that the final scene, by the way, stroke of genius. This movie was written by Michael DeLuca, who you probably have seen his name on a lot of New Line movies, but he's also written a few things. The most notable for me was Freddy's Dead. And it's like, it's weird to me that he wrote Freddy's Dead, and he wrote a movie like this, and you see him now, and he's like this huge, big-time Oscar-nominated producer, and he's like a really huge deal in the industry now. And I think he was like a head of DreamWorks for a few years too. And his script here, I do think has a lot of strengths in it, and one of the really ingenious things I love about this is the fact that he found a way to make sure that it didn't necessarily date itself, because there's the whole idea of, well, this book is where all this madness lies, and where everything is coming out of this, and it's all based on these books and all that. And then it's like you have the crowd where it's like, oh, I don't read, or oh, I just wait for the movie. And so it's like, if you're going to take over the world with a book, there's going to be a certain portion that you miss. So what do you do about that? And then Heston has that line, oh yeah, the movie's in post-production. And it's like, yes, of course. Of course. Genius move. And then that final last scene, when we have our usual, but still as effective as always, abandoned town and all that. Scenes that look very similar a few years later when Danny Boyle made 28 Days Later. And so we've got this Sam Neill who has covered himself in black crown with crosses, and he's in the blue from where he was locked up, just walking to this movie theater with a bucket of popcorn, and we get to watch one of probably the best descents into madness in movie history, as he realizes that the movie, what is playing in front of him, is the fact that it's everything we just saw. And the realization that comes to him when he kind of has that, almost like a moment of surprise, and then it's hilarious, and then it's devastating, and then it's just somewhere in, the title says it all, it's just a complete and total descent into madness, and probably one of my favorites in movie history, the way we can watch it progressively happen and where it ends up, taking us right back into that rock score. So I really love the way that was done, and I do think it makes up for the moments when it seems like it kind of goes off a little bit. So like I said, I don't think this is the kind of movie people were expecting when it came out, which would explain how it kind of, and when you look at Carpenter's filmography, it's the one that's kind of doesn't always get an immediate shout out. But I think there's certainly a fan base there, and so we're out there, and it's so yes. So I just want to draw attention to that. Now the other movie with "Mad" in the title, about a book that may or may not be coming to life, is the 1989 movie I, Madman, which I think I know two or three people that have seen this movie, or at least heard of it. I'm including myself. And so this is basically, it's played up initially as basically just kind of another slasher movie. It just happens to be taking place inside the book that the character's reading. Something that we would see later in stuff like Nocturnal Animals. Kind of the same concept, we think. So it goes on, and it's very much an 80s horror movie, regardless of any kind of clever setups it might have or clever surprises it might have. It's still very much an 80s horror movie in setup, and a lot of the times in execution as well. We immediately start off with the double fake out, with the whole, we see something and we think it's really playing out, but then, oh, it's just a woman reading a book. But then that goes on, and then it's like, oh no, this was in her reading the story was actually a story within a story, and we have our main character reading this book. It's one of those. But that's really the only thing that's like that. Like I said, it could have toyed with this for a long time and just really gone for the cheap kind of fake out shit, but it only does that in the opening scene. Then we kind of set our realities here. And yeah, like I said, in execution, there's also stuff like the "it's only a cat" scare, where it actually is only a cat. One of her friends does the same thing, where all the scares are like the fake ones, where it's something non-threatening. And we go into the whole thing to when, as the main character starts to realize what's going on, nobody believes her. We're riddled with horror cliches in here, but that's just kind of the interior. When you look at the kind of exterior of it, things are really, there are more wheels turning to this movie than just that stuff. And And so you have this concept where our actress is Jenny, right, who you probably remember from Near Dark, and she is reading this book about this doctor that, get this, has decided to, the love of his life did not like his appearance. So he basically cut everything off all the features off of his face and keeps it covered, and now he's going around killing women and cutting off the parts of their faces to put back on himself so he can make himself this ultimate beautiful creation or something. To basically win back her affection with his appearance. Because that's how crazy people work. That's how their minds work. And the Doctor is played by the effects creator. It's my understanding he actually had, once he came up with the concepts, he had to convince the director, why don't I just play the part, because I can apply it to myself. And it just works out that way. And yeah, there are some interesting effects throughout the movie. And stuff like where they get really kind of graphic. But it's mostly kind of, there's one particular scene where it's the sound effect that stands out when he scalps the redhead and takes her hair to put on himself. And it's like, yeah, we see the gruesomeness that is the scalp in his hand, but it's the sound effect that you remember from this scene. The sound effect is what really grosses you out more than the gore itself. And they do, this is one of those movies that is kind of having fun with itself from beginning to end, so it will kind of throw in a sense of humor, like when he's first seen by her with the scalp on, he's just kind of twirling it in a feminine way, and he says, "Do you like the color?" And it's like, you can tell very easily that the movie's having fun with itself and its concept, and isn't just trying to kind of bask in its kind of horrifying concept here. And I like the fact that this also kind of comes into play because, like I was saying, how they use the sound and the scalp is just there in like a shot or two. It's a movie that has this really twisted concept, and there are those moments where we get like these jarring shots of, like, you know, people with pieces of their face missing or stuff like that, and the gore aspect. But it never basks in the gore, given the kind of concept that it is. This may be the budget we have to thank for this, but I also like to think it was a call to say that we can do the effective parts of this movie without having to need to bask in the gore aspect, because we have plenty of other kind of effects going on, and the way a lot of it's shrouded in mystery or darkness is a lot of what the movie's going for as well. That kind of seems to be kind of a familiar theme when you watch the rest of the scenes play out. And yeah, so throughout the movie there are a lot of very dark silences and people wandering around in the dark. And they do let suspense reign in those scenes. But then it's also kind of like, for a movie that's an hour and 29 minutes, it can feel a bit padded when we have those scenes. Like, the scenes maybe go on a little bit longer, and the suspense has come, but also gone by the time the scene ends. So that kind of weakens the effect just a little bit as it goes, but still, the effort is very commendable. And so talking about having fun with this concept, the great thing about this, and obviously I think we well know by now I tend to go into spoilers in this segment from beginning to end, so that's what I'm going to do. The thing here is, the great thing about the concept is the whole idea of questioning what exactly is going on here through most of the movie, along with our lead character, because she's reading this in the book, and as she reads it in the book, the shit's happening. So the question is the book coming to life? That's basically our first question. Or it's like, as she reads it, is it happening as she reads it? Is she making it happen by reading it? What exactly is this book's power that this is happening? But then there is the second question, which her boyfriend raises, which is, well, the guy is supposedly dead. The guy that wrote it is also the character in it, and it's like, is he a ghost? Is a ghost killing people? Is that what you're trying to say? I suppose it could be. But then there is the third option. He was never dead to begin with. And he is bringing this book to life as kind of finishing out this whole scenario. And the great thing about it is spend a lot of the movie questioning, is the book coming out, Are we going into the book? Or are they two completely different realities, and one is fiction and one's real life? And once you realize, okay, we're in reality, and you pretty much, that becomes set in stone. Like, he was just never dead to begin with, he's just continuing this. Reality. So, they decide they're going to throw you a curveball once you've completely established this. And that goes back to the very opening scene when we saw this monster, when we were inside the book. This monster that was created with a stop-motion effect. It does look dated, but that kind of just adds to its silly charm a little bit as well. So, once we've finally established, and we've come to terms with the fact that we're in reality, this monster returns. And this is our reality, and I thought that was a really clever turn, the way they kind of throw that curveball, and even now, when we've established exactly what's going on, they're still kind of playing with, is this reality? And I really like the way they kind of throw in to kind of, almost kind of keep those questions going, but I do think it's more or less the there's the truth is stranger than fiction thing. I guess that's what the point of the movie is. I don't know. But, here's the thing, though. Here's the thing about I, Madman that kind of gets me, and that is, you think about this concept, and you think about the killer himself. It's a dude that cuts off the features of his face for the woman he loves, then goes around trying to put his face back together with the parts of other people. And then you have the concept of, is this a book? Is this reality? Are they clashing? Is he real? Is he not? And this monster, whichever side he comes from, he's clearly on both, and what that means for the setting of this story. You have all these concepts. You also have a decent performance from Jenny Wright. It's kind of the very believable fear, the whole trying to convince people this is real, or is it? Watching her kind of react to what's on the page, even when she doesn't have to say anything. Keeps those scenes that sound like they'd be kind of, dull, keeps them alive by her expression. But the thing is that you have all this stuff. So how is this movie so incredibly unmemorable? I feel like if I didn't just rewatch this, I wouldn't have been able to mention half the things I just mentioned. Because I've seen it a few times, and every time it just kind of goes right in and right out over the span of a couple of days or so. And just, it really is not a movie that sticks with me. It does everything it does nicely. I think it received relatively critical acclaim. And it seems to have a good reaction from the few people that have seen it. So it's like, obviously I have nobody around me to base this on. Online you can see if it has a few fans as well. But once it's over, it's just kind of over, and it really hardly leaves an impact at all, despite everything it has going into it, which kind of really brings into question just how effective it actually is. That it's effective in the moment, like it's able to stay in the moment and keep that going, though we do have those moments of drag where I feel like the idea is to build suspense, but we kind of lose it halfway through the scene. But we do have really big payoffs towards the end there, and some memorable kill scenes, but then it's just a faded memory. And it's like, I'm really not quite sure what that says about the quality of the movie as a whole, even though it does what it should, and has the effect that it should in the moment. But there's just absolutely no lasting power whatsoever. So I'm going to probably forget most of the things I said in this video about it within the next couple of days, if not tomorrow. But I don't think that makes it bad at all. I mean, if it's good in the moment, there's clearly something to it. But there's definitely something lacking here. There's, like, those moments hit, but they're not hitting hard enough, is the problem. And while it is clever in its concept and how it gets to the points that it does, in the way that it does, there's just so much left to be desired. Maybe it's a lack of more effective suspense. Maybe it's a lack of other characters apart from the only really intriguing characters are our lead and the killer. Especially since we get to kind of see from the killer's perspective so much. Clearly the title states that. But yeah, it's kind of all concept, and once you get past that, there's really not a lot of talking points, and there's not really much else you can add to it. It just kind of is what it is, and it does that well, but then it just fades into the background, which I imagine has a lot to do with the impact it's had over time, because I imagine surely people have seen this, but the thing is you really don't hear about it, and I think it's because what do you really say about it after you've seen it? Besides, it had a few nice payoffs, but there's just no staying power, and that's its problem. So, but I do appreciate that it does what it does well enough, if just for the fact that, in ultimately a very unmemorable way. So, I think clearly In the Mouth of Madness really kind of etches everything in your brain and really has you constantly going into the themes of it all. And like I said, if anything, Madman had to kind of drag itself out a little bit at an hour 29, and at an hour 35, In the Mouth of Madness is 20 minutes too short. And it really, I would have really loved to have seen this kind of go more and more into it. So, yeah, this is pretty obvious. So, that's what we have here. Obviously, we have one more coming this week, and there's going to be a few reviews as well. So I'll be catching 2 in theaters tomorrow. So there's that. So until then, I think we're done here. So.